an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. The candles burned low in the dining hall of Greyhaven Manor as Alistair Pemberton, Duke of Greyhaven, sat at the head of a table set for ghosts. His hand rested beside an empty chair draped in white cloth, untouched for 3 years, while the household whispered and the county watched. Rain hammered against the tall windows on the night Eliza Rowe appeared in the doorway, soaked through and trembling, her eyes meeting his across the silent room. He did not rise. He did not smile. His voice cut through the stillness like a blade through silk. Set another place. The guests froze, wine glasses suspended mid-air, as the woman who had vanished without a word took her seat beside the chair that had waited. And the Duke's face revealed nothing but the terrible discipline of a man who had learned to live with absence. The dining room at Greyhaven Manor held its breath each evening at 7 o'clock. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the light of 3 silver candelabras, their flames steady in the stillness. Servants moved like shadows along the paneled walls, their footsteps muffled by thick carpet, their faces carefully blank. At the head of the table sat Alistair Pemberton, the Duke of Greyhaven, his posture erect, his expression unreadable. To his right, an empty chair stood draped in white linen, its place setting complete. Porcelain plate, crystal glass, silver cutlery, arranged with precision. No one sat there. No one had sat there for 3 years. The guests that evening were few. Lord Carrington, a neighboring landowner with thinning hair and a fondness for claret. Lady Ashford, a widow whose sharp eyes missed nothing. The vicar, Reverend Hollis, whose discomfort showed in the way he tugged at his collar. They had learned not to ask about the empty chair. The first time someone had dared, the Duke's silence had been so complete, so cold, that the question died unfinished. Now they simply accepted it, as one accepts the eccentricities of the powerful, with polite indifference and private speculation. The first course arrived, soup in delicate bowls. The servants ladled a portion into the bowl at the empty place setting. Steam rose and dissipated. No one remarked upon it. Conversation limped along, stilted and cautious. Lord Carrington mentioned the harvest. Lady Ashford commented on the weather. The vicar offered a blessing that seemed to stretch longer than necessary, as if words could fill the vacuum left by the absent guest. Alistair ate without appetite. He had perfected the art of appearing engaged while his mind wandered elsewhere. 3 years. 1,095 dinners. 1,095 times he had watched servants set that place, pour wine into that glass, remove the untouched plate at evening's end. It had begun as discipline, a refusal to accept what had happened, a way to maintain order when everything inside him had shattered. Now it was something else, a ritual, a vigil, a stubbornness so deep it had become indistinguishable from faith. The household staff whispered, of course, in the kitchens, in the scullery, in the narrow servants' corridors, where the Duke never ventured. They called it madness, obsession, a grief that had curdled into something unhealthy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dawes, defended him with tight-lipped loyalty, but even she could not explain it. The under-butler claimed the Duke had loved a woman once, though no one could agree on who she had been. A lady from London, some said, a distant cousin, a widow who had stayed one summer and never returned. The stories shifted and multiplied, but the chair remained. Lady Ashford set down her spoon with deliberate care. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "I wonder if you have considered hosting a larger gathering this season. The county would benefit from your hospitality." Alistair met her gaze. His eyes were gray, the color of winter skies. "I am not inclined toward large gatherings, Lady Ashford. Of course, forgive my presumption." She smiled, but her eyes flicked toward the empty chair. "It is only that Greyhaven was once known for its warmth. Your late wife, God rest her soul, had such a gift for bringing people together." The mention of his late wife hung in the air like smoke. Alistair's expression did not change. "My late wife has been gone for 5 years. The world has continued without her gatherings." Indeed, Lady Ashford's smile thinned, and yet some absences leave a greater void than others. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lord Carrington cleared his throat and launched into a story about his hunting dogs. The vicar nodded along with desperate enthusiasm. The servants refilled glasses and removed plates with practiced efficiency. And the empty chair sat, draped and silent, a presence more powerful than any living guest. When the meal finally ended, Alistair dismissed his guests with polite brevity. They departed into the night, their carriages clattering down the gravel drive, and the manor settled into its familiar quiet. Alistair remained at the table. The candles had burned low. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room. He reached out and touched the edge of the white cloth covering the chair. The linen was cool beneath his fingers, smooth, untouched by time. Who was she? The question haunted him, as it haunted the household. But unlike the servants, Alistair knew the answer. He knew her name, her voice, the way she moved through a room as if trying not to disturb the air itself. He knew the exact moment he had realized she was gone, and the hollow certainty that had settled in his chest when no explanation came. No letter, no word, just an empty room, and a silence that had lasted 3 years. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting. The clock in the hall chimed 10. Upstairs, the manor waited, vast and cold. He would walk its corridors, as he did every night, checking locks and extinguishing lamps, performing the small rituals that kept chaos at bay. And tomorrow, at 7 o'clock, the chair would be set again. The plate would be filled. The wine would be poured, and he would sit and wait, as he had waited every night for 3 years, for a woman who had left without saying goodbye. Eliza Rowe had not been born to Greyhaven, but she had become part of it in the way quiet things do, slowly, imperceptibly, until her absence would have left a gap no one could name. She had arrived 7 years ago, as companion to the Duchess, Catherine Pemberton, a woman of grace and failing health, who needed someone to read aloud, to organize correspondence, to sit beside her in the long afternoons when the Duke was occupied with estate business. Eliza had been 28 then, educated beyond her station by a schoolmaster father who had died leaving her nothing but a love of books and a precarious independence. The position had been a lifeline. Companion work was respectable but invisible. She would live in comfort, eat at the household's expense, and occupy a space between servant and family that required constant negotiation. She had accepted with quiet gratitude and moved into a small room on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens. Catherine had been kind, frail but sharp-minded with a dry humor that surprised Eliza. They had spent hours in the drawing room, Eliza reading from novels and poetry, while Catherine embroidered, or simply closed her eyes and listened. In the evenings, when the Duke joined them, the three would sit by the fire, and Catherine would ask Eliza's opinion on this or that passage, drawing her into the conversation as if she were a guest rather than an employee. It was in those moments that Eliza had first noticed the Duke watching her, not with impropriety, but with a kind of quiet attention, as if he were trying to understand how she fit to the household's geometry. After Catherine's death, Eliza had expected to be dismissed. Companions were tied to their employers. When the employer died, the position dissolved, but the Duke had asked her to stay. The household still needed organizing, he said. The library was in disarray. There were tenant matters that required correspondence, and he had no patience for the social niceties that smoothed such interactions. Eliza could help, if she was willing. She had been willing, more than willing. Greyhaven had become home, and if she was honest with herself, the Duke had become something she could not name. Not love, not then, but a presence she sought without meaning to, a voice she listened for in the corridors, a man she had begun to see not as a title, but as a person, reserved, disciplined, carrying a loneliness he would never admit. They had fallen into a rhythm. Mornings in the library, where Eliza catalogued books, and the Duke reviewed estate papers at the wide oak desk. Afternoons when he would ask her opinion on a letter, or she would read aloud from a volume of history while he listened, his gaze fixed on the window. Evenings by the fire, where conversation drifted from the mundane to the philosophical, and the boundaries between employer and companion blurred into something neither of them acknowledged. It was a quiet intimacy, dangerous in its subtlety. Eliza knew the rules of her position. She was dependent on his goodwill, vulnerable in ways a man of his rank could never be. She had no family, no inheritance, no claim to security beyond his continued tolerance. And yet, in those long evenings, she had felt seen, valued, as if her thoughts mattered, as if she mattered. Then one morning, everything had changed. It had been early spring. The estate was stirring with the season's work. Repairs, planting, the endless cycle of rural life. Eliza had been in the library, reviewing a stack of documents Catherine had left behind. Old correspondence, receipts, notes on charitable donations. Most of it was routine. But tucked between two letters, she had found a bond. A financial instrument she did not fully understand, but which bore the Duke's name, and a sum that made her breath catch. She had taken it to the estate office. The steward, Mr. Brennan, had glanced at it and nodded. "Ah, yes, that's the Halden bond, due for renewal soon. His Grace will need to sign." "What is it for?" Eliza had asked. "Land lease. Standard arrangement. Nothing to concern yourself with, Miss Rowe." But something had felt wrong. The language was dense, the terms unclear. Eliza had no formal training in finance, but her father had taught her to read carefully, to question what she did not understand. That evening, she had taken the bond to her room and studied it by candlelight. And slowly, horribly, she had begun to see the trap. The bond was fraudulent, not in its form, but in its substance. It claimed the Duke owed a debt to a creditor named Halden, and that to satisfy the debt, he would need to sell a portion of the estate's tenant lands. But the debt itself was fabricated. The original loan had never been made. Someone had forged the documents, creating an obligation out of nothing. And if the Duke signed, families would be displaced, homes would be lost. And the Duke, believing he was acting honorably, would become the instrument of their ruin. Eliza had sat in her small room, the bond trembling in her hands, and understood the impossible position she was in. If she brought this to the Duke, who would he believe? A woman with no standing, accusing the estate administrator of fraud. Halden would deny it. He would turn the accusation back on her. She had access to documents. She had been alone in the library. It would be her word against his, and she would lose. Worse, she would be accused of forgery herself, and the scandal would destroy not only her, but the Duke's reputation. If she said nothing, the Duke would sign. The fraud would succeed, and she would have to watch as families were torn from their homes, knowing she could have stopped it. There had been only one option, an option so desperate it had felt like stepping off a cliff. She would leave, disappear without explanation. Her sudden absence would create confusion, delay the bond's execution. The Duke would investigate. He would question, and perhaps, in that questioning, the truth would surface, without her having to speak it. She had packed, in the middle of the night, one small bag, a few clothes, the little money she had saved. She had left no letter, no goodbye. To explain would be to implicate herself. To stay would be to watch everything crumble. So she had walked out into the darkness, down the long drive, away from the only home she had known, and into a future that held nothing but uncertainty. For 3 years, she had lived in a coastal town 2 counties away. She had found work as a seamstress, then as a tutor for a merchant's children. She had survived, but survival was not living. Every day, she had wondered if the Duke had discovered the fraud, if the families had been spared, if he hated her for leaving, if he remembered her at all. And then 2 weeks ago, she had received a letter, not from the Duke, but from Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper. A brief note, carefully worded. The estate was secure, the tenants were safe, and the Duke had never stopped setting a place for her at dinner. Eliza had read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She had not allowed herself to hope. Hope was too painful. But the words had lodged in her chest like a splinter, and she had known, with a certainty that terrified her, that she had to return, not to reclaim anything, not to ask forgiveness, but to see, one last time, if the man she had left behind was the man she remembered, or if 3 years of absence had turned her into a ghost he no longer recognized. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was heavy with clouds. The next, rain lashed the windows of Greyhaven Manor, driven by wind that howled through the eaves. Inside, the dining room was a pool of light and warmth, insulated from the chaos outside. The guests had arrived earlier than usual, seeking shelter from the weather. Lord Carrington shook rain from his coat. Lady Ashford complained about the state of the roads. The vicar murmured something about divine temperament. Alistair sat at the head of the table, his attention divided between his guests and the storm. Lightning flickered, illuminating the room in brief, stark flashes. Thunder rolled, deep and resonant. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, setting out the meal, filling glasses, maintaining the rituals that kept the household running. And as always, the empty chair sat draped and waiting, its place setting perfect. The meal began. Conversation was subdued, overpowered by the storm's noise. Lady Ashford picked at her food. Lord Carrington drank more than he ate. The vicar offered a prayer for travelers caught in the weather. Alistair listened with half his attention, his mind elsewhere. He had learned to endure these dinners, to perform his role as host, while his thoughts wandered to the past. To a woman who had once sat in this room, quiet and self-contained, her presence a comfort he had taken for granted, until it was gone. The door to the dining room opened. The butler, Mr. Graves, stepped inside, his face pale. He moved to Alistair's side and bent low, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. There is someone at the door." Alistair frowned. "At this hour? In this weather?" "Yes, Your Grace." Graves hesitated. "A woman. She is asking for shelter." "Then provide it." "You do not need my permission for that." "Your Grace." Graves' voice dropped further. "I believe you should see her yourself." Something in the butler's tone made Alistair set down his fork. He glanced at his guests, who were watching with thinly veiled curiosity. "Excuse me a moment." He rose and followed Graves into the entrance hall. The storm's noise was louder here, rain drumming against the door. A servant stood nearby, holding a lamp. And in the center of the hall, dripping onto the marble floor, stood a woman. She was soaked through. Her cloak clung to her shoulders. Her hair, dark and wet, was plastered to her face. Her dress was plain, the fabric cheap and travel-worn. But her eyes, when they met his, were unmistakable. Brown, steady, filled with something he could not name. Eliza. Alistair felt the floor tilt beneath him. 3 years. 3 years of waiting, of wondering, of setting that damned chair every night. And now she stood before him, real and solid, and impossibly present. He could not speak, could not move. The storm raged outside, but inside, the silence was absolute. Eliza's lips parted. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. I did not know where else to go." He found his voice. It came out colder than he intended. "You did not know where else to go." She faltered. "I had hoped you might allow me shelter for the night. I can leave in the morning." Shelter. He repeated the word as if testing its weight. His mind was a storm to match the one outside. Anger, relief, confusion. 100 questions clawing for release. But his training held. His discipline. He turned to Graves. "Prepare a guest room. Provide Miss Rowe with dry clothing and a meal." "Your Grace." Graves bowed and disappeared up the stairs. Alistair looked back at Eliza. She had not moved. Water pooled at her feet. She looked smaller than he remembered. Older. There were lines at the corners of her eyes, a weariness in the set of her shoulders. But she was here. After 3 years of silence, she was here. "Wait in the drawing room," he said. "I will join you shortly." She nodded and moved toward the drawing room door, her steps hesitant. He watched her go, then turned and walked back to the dining room. His guests looked up as he entered. He forced his expression into something resembling calm. "Forgive me, an unexpected visitor. The storm has driven her to seek shelter." Lady Ashford's eyes gleamed. "How charitable of you, Your Grace. I trust she is not too distressed. She will be cared for." He resumed his seat. The meal continued. But his mind was no longer present. It had followed Eliza into the drawing room, where she waited, and the questions that had haunted him for 3 years roared back to life, with a force that made his hands tremble. When the meal finally ended, he dismissed his guests with barely concealed impatience. They departed into the storm, their carriages splashing through the rain. The house fell quiet. Alistair stood in the entrance hall, staring at the closed drawing room door. He had waited 3 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he had no idea what to say. He opened the door. Eliza stood by the fire, dressed in a borrowed gown that was too large for her. Her hair was still damp, combed back from her face. She turned as he entered, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The fire crackled. Rain streaked the windows. The years between them felt both infinite and non-existent. "You left," he said. The words came out flat, accusatory. "Yes," without a word, without explanation. "Yes, why?" She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Because I had no choice. You had a choice. His voice rose, the discipline cracking. You could have spoken to me. Trusted me. Instead, you vanished as if you had never existed. I could not. She stopped, shook her head. You would not understand. Then make me understand. He stepped closer. 3 years, Eliza. 3 years of silence. Do you have any idea what that did? To this house, to me. She met his gaze. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. I know, and I am sorry, but I cannot explain. Not yet, not tonight. He wanted to shout, to demand answers. But something in her expression stopped him. A fragility he had never seen before. A brokenness that mirrored his own. He took a breath, forced himself to step back. You will stay the night. In the morning, we will speak, and you will tell me everything. Yes, her voice was barely audible. He turned and walked to the door, paused, looked back. The chair, he said. At dinner. Did Mrs. Dawes tell you? Eliza nodded. Why did you come back? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was soft, almost lost beneath the storm's noise. Because I needed to know if you were still the man I left behind, or if I had destroyed that too. Alistair said nothing. He left the room and closed the door behind him. And for the first time in 3 years, he did not go to the dining room to look at the empty chair, because the woman it had waited for was no longer a ghost. She was real, and he had no idea what to do with that. Morning arrived cold and gray. The storm had passed, leaving the ground sodden and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Inside Greyhaven Manor, the household stirred with a tension that needed no explanation. Word had spread. The woman had returned, the one the Duke had waited for. The servants whispered in corners, their voices low and speculative. Mrs. Dawes moved through the corridors with tight-lipped efficiency, silencing gossip with a single look. But even she could not stop the rumors from spreading. Eliza woke in a guest room on the 2nd floor. The bed was soft, the linens clean, but she had barely slept. Every creak of the house had startled her. Every distant footstep had made her heart race. She rose and dressed in the borrowed gown, then stood by the window, looking out at the grounds. The gardens were overgrown. The hedges needed trimming. It was still Greyhaven, but it felt different, quieter, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Breakfast was brought to her room by a young maid who avoided eye contact. Eliza ate without appetite, then ventured into the corridor. The house was familiar and strange at once. She knew these walls, these portraits, but she no longer belonged to them. She was a guest now, an intruder. She made her way downstairs, uncertain where to go, and found herself drawn to the library. The door was ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she remembered. Tall shelves lined with books, the wide oak desk by the window, the scent of paper and leather. She moved to the desk and ran her fingers along its surface. How many hours had she spent here? Reading, organizing, existing in a space that had felt safe and purposeful. The door opened behind her. She turned. Alistair stood in the doorway, dressed in riding clothes, his hair damp from the morning air. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You always loved this room, he said. Yes. He stepped inside and closed the door. We need to talk. I know. He moved to the desk and leaned against it, his arms crossed. 3 years ago, you left without explanation. You took nothing, left no word. The household was in chaos. I searched. I sent inquiries to every town within 50 miles. No one had seen you. It was as if you had simply ceased to exist. Eliza's throat tightened. I am sorry. Sorry is not enough. His voice was hard. I need to understand. Why did you leave? She looked at him. This man she had thought about every day for 3 years. She wanted to tell him everything, but the words stuck in her throat. I left to protect you. Protect me? He laughed, a bitter sound. From what? From making a choice you could not live with. He stared at her. That makes no sense. I know. She turned away, her hands clenched. But it is the truth. Then explain it. I cannot. Not yet. Why not? Because if I do, you will not believe me. Or worse, you will. And it will destroy what little trust remains between us. He pushed off the desk and moved toward her. You think there is trust between us? After what you did? She met his gaze. I think there is something. or you would not have set that chair every night for 3 years. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alistair's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists, but he did not look away. That chair, he said quietly, was the only thing that kept me sane. It was a reminder that you had existed, that I had not imagined you. Tears pricked Eliza's eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, and yet you did. Yes, her voice broke, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. He turned away, his shoulders rigid. I do not know what to do with you, Eliza. I do not know if I can forgive you, but I also cannot send you away. Not yet. Not until I understand. Then let me stay, she said, just for a little while. Let me prove that I did not leave out of cruelty, that there was a reason. Even if you never forgive me, let me show you that. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was weary. You can stay, but you will not be a guest. You will work. The estate needs help. The tenant school requires a teacher. If you are going to be here, you will earn your place. I will. Relief flooded through her. Thank you. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. Yes, stay away from the dining room. I cannot. He stopped, shook his head. Just stay away. He left. Eliza sank into the chair by the desk and buried her face in her hands. She had returned. But the distance between them felt greater than the 3 years she had been gone, and she had no idea how to bridge it. The days that followed were strange and strained. Eliza took up residence in a small room near the servants' quarters. It was not the room she had occupied before, but she did not complain. She threw herself into work, teaching the tenant children in the estate's modest schoolhouse. The children were wary at first, unsure of this quiet woman who spoke with patience and precision, but gradually they warmed to her. She taught them letters and numbers, read them stories, and listened to their chatter with a focus that made them feel seen. The household, however, was less forgiving. Servants whispered as she passed. Some were curious, others resentful. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dawes, was polite but distant, her loyalty to the Duke absolute. Only the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Bell, showed any warmth, offering Eliza tea in the kitchen and asking no questions. Alistair avoided her. They crossed paths occasionally in the corridors or the grounds, but he never stopped to speak. He would nod, his expression carefully neutral, and continue on his way. It was a kind of torture, to be so close and yet so unreachable. Eliza told herself it was what she deserved. She had left him. She had no right to expect warmth. But the nights were the hardest. Lying in her narrow bed, she could hear the faint sounds of the household settling, and she knew that downstairs, in the dining room, the chair was still set. The ritual continued. Even with her presence in the house, he had not stopped. She did not know if that was hope or despair. One afternoon, she was walking back from the schoolhouse when she encountered a man near the estate office. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and eyes that assessed her with cold calculation. She recognized him immediately. Mr. Halden, the estate administrator, the man whose fraud had driven her away. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Miss Rowe, what a surprise to see you here. Mr. Halden, she kept her voice even. I had heard you returned. The household has been quite abuzz with the news. I am sure they have. He stepped closer. Tell me, Miss Rowe, what brings you back after all this time? Surely not sentiment. That is not your concern. Oh, but it is. His voice dropped. You see, I remember you. You were always so diligent, always poking about in documents and records. I wondered, at the time, if you had seen something you should not have. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. I do not know what you mean. Do you not? He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. You should have stayed gone, Miss Rowe. Coming back was a mistake. He straightened and walked away, leaving her standing in the cold. Eliza's hands shook, he knew, or at least he suspected, and if he felt threatened, he would act. She had to tell Alistair, but how could she, when he barely spoke to her, when the gulf between them felt insurmountable? That evening, she made her way to the library. She knew he often worked there after dinner. She knocked softly and waited. His voice came from within. Enter. She opened the door. He was at the desk, papers spread before him. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Eliza, I need to speak with you. He set down his pen. About what? About why I left. His expression hardened. You said you were not ready to explain. I was not. But I am now. She stepped inside and closed the door. Because if I do not, something terrible is going to happen, and I will not be able to stop it this time. He studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, she sat. The fire crackled. The room felt both intimate and vast. She took a breath. 3 years ago, I found a document. A bond. It claimed you owed a debt to a creditor, and that to satisfy it, you would need to sell tenant lands. He frowned. I remember no such debt. That is because it did not exist. The bond was fraudulent. Someone had forged it to trick you into signing. If you had, families would have lost their homes. His face went still. Who? I do not have proof, but I believe it was Mr. Halden. Halden. He said the name slowly, as if testing it. Why would he do that? For profit. If the lands were sold, he could have arranged for a buyer. Someone who would pay him a commission. Or perhaps he intended to buy them himself through a proxy. Alistair leaned back in his chair, his mind clearly racing. And you discovered this? Yes. Why did you not come to me? She met his gaze. Because I had no proof. And because I knew what would happen if I accused him. He would have turned it back on me. I had access to documents. I was alone in the library. It would have been my word against his. And I would have lost. Worse, I would have been accused of forgery. The scandal would have destroyed not only me, but your reputation. He was silent for a long moment. So you left? Yes. I thought if I disappeared, it would create confusion, delay the signing, give you time to investigate. And you thought I would not come after you. I thought you would be angry. I thought you would move on. I did not think. Her voice broke. I did not think you would wait. He stood and moved to the window, his back to her. I did not wait out of hope, Eliza. I waited because I could not accept that you were gone, that you had left without reason. I needed to believe there was an explanation, even if I never heard it. And now you have. Yes. He turned to face her. And I do not know what to do with it. You investigate, she said. You look at the records. You find the proof I could not. And if I do, if you are right, then you stop him, before he tries again. He nodded slowly. Very well. I will review the ledgers. But Eliza, yes, if you are wrong. If this is some elaborate excuse, I am not wrong. She stood, her voice firm. And I am not lying. I left to save you from becoming the instrument of cruelty. I left because I loved you too much to watch you suffer the truth. The words hung in the air between them. She had not meant to say it, but it was out now, raw and undeniable. Alistair stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked past her and out of the room, leaving her standing alone by the fire. Alistair did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, surrounded by ledgers and documents, his mind churning. Eliza's words echoed in his head. A fraudulent bond. Halden. The accusation seemed impossible. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more it made a terrible kind of sense. He began with the estate's financial records. He was not a man who enjoyed paperwork, but he was thorough when necessity demanded it. He traced payments, cross-referenced dates, and compared entries. And slowly, discrepancies began to emerge. Small things at first. A payment to a land agent he did not recognize. A bond renewal that did not match his memory. Lease agreements that seemed altered. By dawn he had found it. The bond Eliza had described. It was buried in a stack of documents awaiting his signature, dated 3 years ago. The language was dense, the terms convoluted, but the intent was clear. If he had signed, he would have been obligated to sell a portion of the tenant lands to satisfy a debt that had never existed. The creditor was listed as a man named Halden, the same Halden who served as his estate administrator. Alistair sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. She had been right. Eliza had been right. And she had left to protect him, to protect the tenants, to protect everyone but herself. He stood and walked to the window. The sun was rising, casting pale light over the grounds. He thought of the 3 years he had spent in anger and confusion. The dinners, the empty chair, the ritual that had become his anchor. And he thought of Eliza, living in some distant town, alone and afraid, carrying the weight of a truth she could not speak. He had to confront Halden, but he needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. He called for his solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, a meticulous man who had served the estate for decades. When Whitmore arrived, Alistair laid out the documents and explained the situation. Whitmore's expression grew graver with each word. "This is fraud, Your Grace," Whitmore said. "If what you suspect is true, Mr. Halden has committed a serious crime. Can you prove it? I will need time. But yes, if the bond is fraudulent, there will be inconsistencies, forged seals, altered signatures. I will find them. Do it." Alistair's voice was hard. "And do it quickly." Whitmore bowed and left. Alistair remained in his study, staring at the ledgers. He had been blind, trusting, and Eliza had paid the price for his ignorance. He thought of her standing in the library, her voice breaking as she confessed why she had left. And he thought of the words she had spoken, the ones that had driven him from the room. "I left because I loved you too much to watch you suffer the truth." He had not known what to say, how to respond, so he had fled, like a coward. And now, as the morning light filled the room, he realized that he owed her more than silence. He owed her the truth. And perhaps if he was brave enough, he owed her forgiveness. The storm returned that night, not as violent as before, but steady and relentless. Rain drummed against the windows. Wind rattled the eaves. Inside Greyhaven Manor, the household moved through its routines with a tension that had become familiar. Eliza sat in her small room, listening to the storm and wondering if she had made a mistake. She had told Alistair the truth. But would he believe her? Or would he see her as a liar, a manipulator, someone who had invented a story to justify her abandonment? A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Mrs. Dawes standing in the corridor, her expression unreadable. "Miss Rowe, His Grace requests your presence in the estate office." Eliza's heart sank. "Yes." Immediately, she followed Mrs. Dawes through the darkened corridors. The house was quiet, most of the staff already retired for the night. The estate office was on the ground floor, a small room lined with shelves and filing cabinets. When Eliza entered, she found Alistair standing by the desk, his solicitor beside him. And seated in a chair, looking pale and furious, was Mr. Halden. Alistair's gaze met hers. "Come in, Eliza. Close the door." She did as he asked, her hands trembling. The room felt suffocating. Halden's eyes were fixed on her, filled with venom. Alistair gestured to a chair. "Sit." She sat. Alistair remained standing, his posture rigid. "Mr. Whitmore has completed his investigation. The bond you described was indeed fraudulent. The seals were forged, the debt fabricated. Mr. Halden intended to deceive me into signing, thereby forcing the sale of tenant lands for his own profit." Halden surged to his feet. "This is absurd. You are taking the word of a woman who abandoned you over. Sit down." Alistair's voice was cold as winter. Halden sat. Alistair continued. "Miss Rowe discovered the fraud 3 years ago. She left to prevent me from signing, knowing that if she accused you directly, you would turn the accusation back on her. She sacrificed her position, her security, and her reputation to protect this estate and its tenants." Halden's face twisted. "She is lying. She forged those documents herself. She enough." Alistair's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Whitmore has examined the seals. They do not match the estate's official seals, but they do match seals found in your office. You are dismissed, Mr. Halden, effective immediately. You will leave this estate tonight. If you attempt to return, or to spread falsehoods about Miss Rowe, I will have you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Halden stood, his face white with rage. He looked at Eliza, his expression murderous. "You will regret this. Leave." Alistair's voice was deadly calm. "Now." Halden stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Whitmore gathered his papers and bowed. "I will see to the legal particulars, Your Grace." "Thank you, Whitmore." The solicitor left. Eliza and Alistair were alone. She could not look at him, could not speak. The weight of the past 3 years pressed down on her, and she felt as if she might shatter. "Eliza," his voice was soft now, gentle. "Look at me." She raised her eyes. He was watching her, with an expression she could not name. Not anger, not pity, something deeper, something that made her chest ache. "You were right," he said, "about everything, and I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have seen what was happening. But I was blind, and you paid the price for my blindness. You could not have known," she whispered. "I should have." He moved closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You left to protect me, to protect the tenants, and I spent 3 years hating you for it. You had every right to hate me. No, he shook his head. I had no right. Because you did what I should have done. You saw the truth and acted on it, even when it cost you everything. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I am sorry for doubting you, for not seeing, for all of it. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I did not want to leave you. I know. I thought about you every day. Wondered if you were safe. If you had discovered the fraud. If you, her voice broke, if you had moved on. I did not move on. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, solid, real. I could not. Because some part of me always believed you would come back. And when you did, I was too much of a coward to admit how much I had missed you. She looked down at their joined hands. What happens now? Now, he smiled, a small, tentative thing. Now we begin again. Not as we were, but as we are. If you are willing. She met his gaze. I am willing. He pulled her to her feet and, for the first time in 3 years, held her, not as an employer, not as a benefactor, but as a man who had waited and hoped and finally understood. And in that embrace, the distance between them collapsed, and the past began, at last, to heal. The days that followed were quiet. The household adjusted to Halden's absence. A new administrator was hired, a careful man recommended by Mr. Whitmore. The tenants, when they learned what had nearly happened, expressed their gratitude in small ways. A basket of apples left on the doorstep, a repaired fence, a nod of respect when Eliza passed. She continued teaching the children, and slowly, the whispers faded. The servants began to accept her presence. Mrs. Dawes even offered a rare smile. But the greatest change was between Eliza and Alistair. They did not rush. They did not make grand declarations. Instead, they rebuilt what had been broken, piece by piece. They walked the grounds together in the mornings. They sat by the fire in the evenings, talking about books and estate matters, and the small, ordinary things that make up a life. And slowly, carefully, they learned to trust again. One evening, Alistair invited her to dinner. Not in the dining room, but in a smaller parlor, where the table was set for 2. She hesitated at the doorway, uncertain. He smiled and gestured to the chair. No ghosts tonight, just us. She sat. The meal was simple, but well prepared. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing someone deeply. When the meal ended, Alistair stood and offered his hand. Come with me. She took his hand and followed him through the corridors. He led her to the dining room. The long table was empty now, the candelabras unlit, and at the head of the table, the chair sat, still draped in white linen, still waiting. Alistair stopped before it. For 3 years, I sat this chair, every night. It was my way of holding on, of refusing to accept that you were gone. He turned to her. But you are not gone. You are here, and I do not need this anymore. He reached out. With slow deliberation, removed the white cloth. He folded it carefully and set it aside. Then he pulled the chair away from the table and placed it near the fireplace. Not discarded, but repurposed. A part of the room, but no longer the center of it. He turned back to Eliza. I do not want to live in the past anymore. I want to live in the present, with you. If you will have me. She stepped forward and took his hands. I will have you, not as I did before, but as we are now, equals, partners. He smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded. Then let us begin. They stood together in the quiet dining room, the storm outside finally spent, the house settling into peace. And in that moment, the chair was no longer a symbol of absence. It was a reminder of what they had survived, of the courage it took to leave, and the courage it took to return, and of the love that had waited, patient and enduring, until they were ready to claim it. The weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, bringing with it new growth and a sense of renewal. Eliza continued her work at the tenant school, and Alistair involved her more deeply in the estate's management. They worked side by side, making decisions together, building something that felt less like a restoration and more like a creation. The household accepted her fully now. She was no longer the woman who had left. She was the woman who had returned. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens, Alistair stopped by a bench overlooking the fields. He turned to her, his expression serious. There is something I need to ask you. What is it? When you left, you said you did it because you loved me. Do you still? She looked at him, This man who had waited for her, who had forgiven her, who had learned to see her not as a ghost, but as a person. Yes, she said, I still do. Then marry me. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Eliza felt her breath catch. Alistair, I know the world will talk. I know there will be scandal. But I do not care. I have spent 3 years caring what the world thinks, and it brought me nothing but misery. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. As my wife, as my partner, as the woman I should have asked to stay 3 years ago. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. Yes, yes, I will marry you. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Not with the passion of youth, but with the depth of two people who had been tested and had emerged stronger. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. We will face the world together. Together, she agreed. They were married in the small chapel on the estate, with only a handful of witnesses. The vicar performed the ceremony with quiet dignity. Mrs. Dawes wept openly. The tenants gathered outside, offering their blessings. And when it was done, Alistair and Eliza walked back to the manor hand in hand, ready to begin the life they had both fought so hard to claim. Years later, when the story of the Duke of Greyhaven and his wife was told, people remembered the chair. They remembered the 3 years of waiting, the quiet dinners, the empty place setting, and they wondered at the kind of love that could endure such absence. But those who knew the truth understood that it was not the waiting that mattered. It was the courage to return, the willingness to forgive, the strength to rebuild what had been broken. Eliza and Alistair lived the rest of their lives at Greyhaven. They had children who played in the gardens and learned to read in the library. They grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. And every evening, as the sun set over the fields, they would sit together by the fire, the chair that had once been draped in white now, simply a piece of furniture, worn and comfortable, a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken. Some wait for love to return as it was. But the Duke of Greyhaven learned a wiser truth. Love does not return. It transforms. And in that transformation, if we are brave enough to let it, we are made whole.